Slide on only. I'll just do a quick recap of what we have done last time. Anybody remembers? You can unmute your mic and tell what have we done the last session pertaining to the gospel formation. In detail, we have done something. What was it regarding the formation? In particular, I had explained about the 3 stages of gospel formation. What is the first stage? Does anyone remember? We can unmute and say, okay, I think we will not waste our time on that. I think the 3-stage gospel formation that I had touched upon was, the first stage is a stage of oral tradition, and it begins with Jesus himself during his lifetime and his ministry, how whatever he had taught and whatever he had said, okay, his teachings and preachings were all gathered together, and there's a term that is given for that is called the Jesus traditions. So all the traditions were being gathered together. I have given the example of how a big river will have several tributaries that will be emptying its water into the main river. So like that, all the gathering of the Jesus traditions, they begin. So orality is by mouth what was being proclaimed. So today I will be running you through the main parts of the synoptic gospels. In that, in particular, we have the Gospel of Mark, which goes mostly to the oral tradition. They say that Gospel of Mark was more or less the preaching that Saint Peter did in Rome. So most of the congregation of the church in Rome, which also comprised many soldiers, Roman soldiers also probably they say, there was a request that was made by them, okay, to Peter and especially to Mark, to gather all the preachings of Saint Peter into a sort of, a systematic document which would be available to everyone. And that is the rich history that is behind the Gospel of Mark. So the first stage of gospel formation is the oral tradition. Then we have the eyewitness testimony. So as I explained to you last time, in the post-resurrection, okay, the post-resurrection era, it was the experience of the resurrection that had finally transformed all the disciples. So they began to understand all the Old Testament fulfillments that were being promised in the Tanakh and how they were coming to be fulfilled in the life and death of Jesus and his resurrection too. So all the eyewitnesses' testimony, the beginnings of the oral traditions, they all come together into the second stage of gospel formation, which we call the key eyewitness testimony. And then you have the final stage wherein all the traditions are gathered together, and we have the text of the 4 gospels, which finally went into the NT canon, which we know today as the New Testament gospel, the 4 gospels. So with this background, we go forward now. Let us see. Today's session in particular, we are going to look at a very peculiar relationship that exists between all the 4 gospels. When we talk about the gospels, what exactly are they? In simple words, if anybody asks us to define what the gospels are, they are the portrayals of Jesus, the life of Jesus through the eyes of 4 different narrators. But not only the narrators, the sayings and all also attributed to Jesus have all been put in those texts. And that's how we have 4 accounts, but of the single central message of Jesus. But among these 4 gospels, there exists some sort of relation, especially the first 3 gospels, that is Matthew, Mark and Luke. If you look together, I've already touched upon this last time. There was a term that was given to these 3. Somebody realized that, there was a lot of familiarity, a common material between all the 3 texts of this first 3 gospels. And seen together, there appeared to be a lot of commonalities between the 3. And so this seen together is called synopsis. It comes from the word, okay, it comes from the, when we talk about these 3 gospels being seen together, it comes from the Greek word synoptikos. Because when they are seen together, you see that there is lot of, not only common material, not only in the themes, but also in the arrangement, in the chronology of how the events are narrated, what comes after what. Okay, so the chronology also seems to be common. The pericopes, I explained to you last time that this particular word pericope means those are episodes in the gospel. Even the arrangement, which pericope comes after which one. So the sequence of the pericopes also, they also seem to be common among these three gospels. Okay, and that's why to understand the development and the history of the rereadings, I have underlined that word rereadings because as I told you, it was a Jesus tradition that kept on evolving with constant rereadings, and then finally the whole thing merges together as a fourth gospel text. Now, to understand the interrelationship among these gospels, it is crucial for us to compare. Okay, and because of this comparison, we come to the conclusion that there is some sort of interdependence between these three gospels. Scholars often call this particular thing the synoptic problem. Why? Because just as there are agreements, not that everywhere the material will be agreeing, okay, in sequence, in theme, whatever, but there are also certain disagreements, okay, which sometimes sound to be like contradictions. I will be running to you through them. So this literary relationship that exists among the synoptics, it was first noticed by our late church father John Chrysostom, who was supposed to be a very fine preacher in the church of Antioch, and Augustine in the 4th century, 4th to 5th century. But not much attention was paid until, later on from 70 AD onwards, like people began, the scholars, biblical scholars, especially from the Protestant church, they began to realize that there was, much beyond similarity in the order of the whole narrative. Remember, I have told you that the Gospels comprise two basic genres. What are they? We have narratives, that is like, something told, narrated. There is a narrator, the Gospel writer or the evangelist is narrating what happened in the life of Jesus, distinctly connected with the preaching of Saint John the Baptist. So, in all the three synoptics, you will find this common factor that Jesus' public life is somehow connected, okay, with the preaching of Saint John the Baptist. So much so that scholars today, biblical scholars today, they will tell us that they are 100% convinced that Jesus was actually first a disciple of Saint John the Baptist. Somehow, some years or some part of his life, he definitely has trained under the Baptist. So this is very striking in the synoptics. Secondly, the public ministry is chiefly confined to Galilee. You will see all the events like that unravel in all the three synoptics. Most of the drama, it all unfolds there in Galilee. Galilee is supposed to be the hotspot of the Lord's ministry. So this is something that is very common to the synoptics. You will find in John's Gospel, when you compare, the entire drama that unfolds, the climax is entirely always it is more in Jerusalem, that Jesus is, all the time locking horns with the Pharisees and the scribes. But here, the public life of Jesus in the synoptics, it is the entire place of where everything occurs is Galilee. Is set forth in certain epochs. Now, what is an epoch? Epoch is supposed to be key times, key moments, okay, in somebody's life. So here in the three synoptics, you find certain epochs that mark the synoptic gospel, such as the early Galilean ministry, the crisis that takes place in Galilee, the ministry in Perea. Perea was a region that was not part of Galilee, but not also part of Judea. It was it was ruled by Herod's brother. And Jerusalem, and the tragic ending, Jerusalem. All these are like epochs, key moments that are, spelled out there in the synoptics. Together with all these resemblances, there is throughout the synoptics a remarkable agreement. What is also very striking is, not only is the concept and all clear, the epochs and also the sequence of the pericope, sometimes there is word-to-word agreement in words and phrases, verbatim we call them. a remarkable agreement also in words and phrases which could have been possible through harmonizing, or more importantly through a close translation of an original Greek text. Okay, so maybe, like, there must have been some common source that was at the disposal of these evangelists, on the basis of which they have drawn all their material. This verbal agreement in the Greek Gospels is all the more very striking and surprising. Why? We have to remember that Jesus did not preach and all in Greek. He definitely spoke, okay, and imparted his teachings in the lingua franca of the people at that point of time. That was Aramaic. That was the language of the common people. I told you, it is a language which is very, very close to Hebrew, a sort of, you can say, a dialect of Hebrew, but not exactly, but they are cousins in language. They are Semitic languages. So Jesus definitely spoke in Aramaic. Remember in Mark, the famous phrase, okay, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Jesus crying out from the cross. It is an Aramaic phrase, okay. Similarly, for Jairus' daughter also, he says Talitha Kumi, that is also an Aramaic phrase. So Jesus actually spoke in Aramaic. So it is very strange that, Gospels which have been written in Greek, you find word-to-word agreement sometimes there. Okay, so are these, do we mean to say that these verbal resemblances are mere accidental similarity? Not at all. There is a reason behind it, and the reason behind it is the interdependence. How the three evangelists, in fact all the four evangelists, how they made use of the sources that were available to them. Hence, they must be products of literary interdependence. So they are dependent on one another in some strange way, we will see. And that interdependence, this literary interdependence among the three synoptic gospels, we call that problem the synoptic problem. Why problem? Not only because there are agreements, but there are also disagreements. Okay, so how to draw the connection in all finality? That is the big conundrum. That is the big puzzle for everyone. An example of same sequence in the pericope is about the healing of the paralytic, call of Levi, and the question about fasting in all the three synoptic gospels is given now in the next slide. This is one example I've given to you to make you see the sequence of all these, okay, these pericopes. Number one, the healing of the paralytic man, the call of Levi, that is Matthew's call, and soon followed by question about fasting. It's very surprising when you look at this, okay, in all the three gospels, in the synoptic gospel, one follows the other and in the same order. Okay, you have first the healing of the paralytic, then the call of Matthew, and then the question about fasting. It's not that in one of the evangelists thing, another episode precedes the other. All of them are in the same order, as you can see over here. Okay, I've put in three columns: Matthew chapter 9 onwards, Mark from chapter 2 onwards, and Luke chapter 5 verse 17 onwards. Look at it. This is the first pericope. In all three, keep a track of the numberings. Okay, those numbers that are given, those are verses that are numbered. So if you look over there, you'll see that it's a sequence that is going on. I've put out the episode, the pericope of the healing of the paralytic. So Matthew also gives you that. Mark also gives you that. Luke also gives you. Go on to the next slide. Again, you will see the same pattern. Next, please, Ellie. See the same pattern over here, continued. Okay, in the 9th verse, call of Levi, then you have the question about fasting. Similarly in Mark, verse 13 onwards, okay, it ends with verse 14, and then soon from verse 15, you have the question about fasting. Look at Gospel of Luke. Similarly, from verse 27 onwards, you have the call of Matthew. Soon after followed, okay, 27 verse 27 to verse 28, call of Matthew. Verse 29 onwards, the entire question of fasting. So have you seen all these three, how they are connected. Now I've given you just one example of the sequence of the pericopes. It cannot be just by accident that Luke also, arranged in the same order, and Mark also arranged in the same order, and Matthew also arranged in the same order. Just simply cannot be. There could be coincidences between two people, but three is very difficult to believe. Another example I'm giving you. An example of near verbatim agreement, word to word agreement in all the three synoptic gospels is given here. Agreement in word order in the sayings. Okay, look at how between Matthew and Luke, and there's another one. Okay, between other two this. Okay, many of the Matthew 3, chapter 3, verse 7 to 10, it tells you about, many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they came to his baptizing, and when he saw these, he asked them, who was it that taught you, brood of vipers, to flee from the vengeance that draws near? Okay, look here also in Luke, you have similar. See, look at the word. He said to the multitudes who came out to be baptized by him, who was it that taught you, brood of vipers, to flee from the vengeance that draws near? I have not highlighted because more or less most of the words agree. So look at this account that you see in Matthew, okay? Compare it to Luke. So you can make out that either Luke has taken it from Matthew or Matthew has taken it from Luke, or another third possibility is both of them could have taken it from some common source. So one more example, agreement in word order in the sayings, Matthew and Luke again. The men of Nineveh will rise up with this generation at the day of judgment. Jesus is saying this, and will leave it without excuse, for they did penance when Jonas preached to them, and behold, behold, a greater than Jonas is here. Look in Luke's account. The queen of the south, okay, will rise up with the men of this generation at the judgment, and will leave them without excuse, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. So you see, many of the places here, phrases or groups of words are common. So this is another example to show that there is something, very similar between the three synoptics. Now we have seen all these in the previous slides. We have seen the agreements between the synoptics. Now let us see what are the disagreements. Each synoptical writer introduces into his narrative episodes which are not related by the other two evangelists. Examples given here. Mark says nothing of the infancy and the early life of Jesus. I had pointed this out last time also, like how you have the infancy narratives you have in Matthew and you have in Luke, but in Mark you don't have that, okay? Neither in John also. Okay? So Matthew and Luke, who speak of them, do not narrate the same facts. Now, though the infancy narratives, that is the birth stories, okay, the birth stories of Jesus, they are narrated in Matthew and Luke, but they are strikingly different from each other. Like for example, in Luke you will find the shepherds coming and visiting. In Matthew's account you will not find that. Okay, so each evangelist, given that they have their own theological motives and theological themes through which they want to bring out their gospel text, there will be certain disagreements. Appear to be disagreement, but when you actually analyze, they are not really serious disagreements. Okay. Similarly, Mark does not even allude to the Sermon on the Mount. Like Matthew's gospel is supposed to be the church's favorite gospel, and that is why Matthew's gospel was given a lot of prominence, and that is why it is also the first in the fourfold gospel canon. Okay. So in Matthew, in Mark, you don't have the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, are supposed to be the focal point of Matthew's Gospel. The Beatitudes today are supposed to be not only from the biblical point of view, from the New Testament perspective, not only a legacy of the NT and legacy of the Christian people, but it is something that has universal application and quoted by people regardless of which religion they belong to. But the same Sermon on the Mount, which was supposed to be one of the most powerful discourses that you find in Matthew, okay, which takes almost 3 chapters. In Mark, there is no mention at all. Luke also does not have Sermon on the Mount, but he has something called a Sermon on the Plain, which is equivalent to that. But what has been contracted by Matthew in his 3 chapters, Luke spreads it out over his entire gospel. So you see how these agreements and disagreements also exist. Luke alone narrates in detail the last journey of Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. This is one of the striking, unique characters of the Gospel of Luke, something that, biblical scholars call it the travel narrative. Luke shows that, the entire public ministry of Jesus is centered in Galilee, but Galilee is not the place where he will attain his glory. His glorification lies finally going to Jerusalem, getting crucified and getting resurrected from there. So Luke alone, he dwells quite a number of chapters. It is called the travel narrative, and during that travel narrative, Jesus teaches his disciples the entire crux of his entire, mission. What was he meant to be? Okay, why he has come into the world. So during the travel narrative, you will find it. This is something very unique to the Gospel of Luke, which you will not find in Mark, neither in John nor in Matthew. On the other hand, Matthew, and Mark record a series of Galilean incidents which are nowhere found in Luke. Luke is totally silent about this. I have just put that out for you so that I will not be able to cover the entire session. You can do it for your homework. Please check out this and see that it does not find any place in Luke. Despite his obvious conciseness, Mark has 2 miracles again, 2 parables wholly that are peculiar only to himself. Matthew, who apparently does not aim at brevity. What is the meaning of brevity and conciseness? I told you Mark is the shortest gospel with only 16 chapters. Okay, rest of the gospels are very big, huge chapters you have. Okay, in John you almost have 21. In Luke you have up to 24, and Matthew even 28. So these are gospels that are very, very lengthy. But Mark is the most shortened gospel. So looks like Mark aimed at brevity, but not Matthew, who apparently does not aim at brevity but makes no reference to the ascension. Look at the ascension. This is something very peculiar. It is there only in the Gospel of Luke. You'll not find that in Matthew. So these type of disagreements, so-called disagreements, like some of the evangelists will be silent about certain episodes, they will highlight certain others which will not be correspondingly found in the other evangelists. This is continued. At times the divergences can appear to be real contradictions, though in reality not really contradictions. Like I have given you examples over here, 2 I will run you through. Number 1, the differences between the genealogies of Jesus. What is the genealogy? Have you seen in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke? These are the only 2 synoptics that narrate the genealogy of Jesus. Genealogy is a lineage. From where did he descend? Remember, Matthew's aim is to show that Jesus is the son of David and the son of Abraham. And in fact, when he begins his Gospel begins with the genealogy. Luke's Gospel does not begin with the genealogy. It begins in the temple in Jerusalem with Zechariah, at prayer. And Luke's genealogy is embedded in chapter 3. And when Luke is giving the genealogy of Jesus, it is like, he begins with Jesus and he comes to the conclusion finally that Jesus finally the son of Adam. So Luke's genealogy, it goes way back right to Adam. Matthew's genealogy traces Jesus' lineage to Abraham and son of David. So though this common factor is there between these 2 synoptics, the way the genealogies are narrated and related, are very different. The accounts of the episode of the demoniacs in Gerasa, this is the demon-possessed man whom Jesus heals. If you read both these accounts, all the 3 accounts, they are The way they are narrated, it's good if you do a little bit of homework, especially on this slide and the previous one. Go back and read all these episodes that have been put out. Then you will be in a better position to see for yourself. The way the pericope is narrated is different in all three. We'll take this one, the third one, the miraculous healing connected with Jericho. This is a very striking contradiction. If you look at all these three episodes, Matthew 20, 29 to 34, Mark, okay, and Luke. In Mark's account of this healing of the blind man in Jericho, he names the man. He gives the name Bartimaeus, okay, Bartimaeus. Bar means son, okay. Timaeus means son of Timaeus. His name is named as son of Timaeus. And he is the one who was healed by Jesus as he was passing through the street of Jericho. He calls him out. So if you look at Mark's version of this healing that took place in Jericho, he names the blind man as Bartimaeus. The same episode, if you compare with Luke also narrates, okay, he gives, but no name of the blind man is given. The name is omitted. Only Mark gives the name. Same episode, if you read through in Matthew, you will see that in Matthew's episode, it is not the healing of a single blind man, but it is two blind men, and not one of them is named. So the miraculous healing connected with Jericho, it is finding place in all the three Gospels. But see how they are narrated? They are narrated in different way, with Mark being the only one who names the person. Similarly, this is a very interesting one, okay, among the disagreements of the petition of the mother of James and John. You remember this? The mother of James and John, the brothers, okay, who are disciples of Jesus, and how the mother, she goes to Jesus and asks that they be given high places, one on the left and one on the right, when he finally, establishes his kingdom. Because even at that point of time, remember, everyone was expecting a political Messiah. So definitely even the disciples had those hopes, okay, that the promised Messiah would come and would restore Israel back to God, okay, and end the subjugation of the Romans. So here you find James and John's mother. She comes nicely and petitions Jesus that when you come into your glory in your kingdom, see that my sons are given, the main places to your left and right. Where do you find the names? These names, Mark's Gospel, when you read, these names don't exist, okay. When you go to Matthew's account tells us that it was the mother of James and John who came to Jesus to petition him. So you see, the same episode is told, but with slight differences, okay. Matthew very often, so from this what do we gather? Matthew very often gathers together. It looks like when you study the literary text of these three synoptic gospels, Matthew very often gathers together topics which are similar. He seems to arrange his matter, okay, in a sort of a logical sequence. Whatever is connected, what makes more sense, okay, in that logical order he seems to be arranging. While Mark and Luke, both of them more or less closely seem to be following the chronological order. Chronological is pertaining to time. Like for example, what comes next? Like suppose he went to Jairus' house first. Then next maybe it is the centurion who comes to it. So according to how they occurred in episodic manner, they arrange their materials. So Luke goes in a logical way arranging his materials. Mark and Luke tend to follow more the chronology. There are different ways of understanding this literary relationship, or what we call the interdependence among the synoptic gospel, especially concerning the direction of dependence. When we talk about direction of dependence, is who was the first one to write and who copied from whom. That is what in simple words we mean to say, the direction of dependence of one gospel on another. And this interdependence, both concerning the agreements, okay, in the material, in the arrangements, in the themes, whatever, and the disagreements as well, is called a synoptic puzzle. also called the synoptic problem. Okay, I have put out this relationship between the synoptic gospel. This is for your understanding. I would suggest just take time off, because this is a very tricky synoptic problem. Is a very huge tangle. It's not very easy to understand it at one go. Okay, that is why I've given you in a diagrammatic manner. Okay, it tells you, if you refer to the diagram over there, make it big, and you will be able to see how the commonalities are there. What is the interrelationship between all three? Like for example, the color, follow also the color coding over there. Unique to mark, okay, that brown color is very small, means material that is found in Mark alone, which you will not find in the remaining two, Luke and Matthew's gospel. Unique to Mark is just 3%, okay. Then 18% is Mark and Matthew in Mark's gospel, okay. The material that is found in Mark and Matthew, that is there in Mark, is 18% of Mark's gospel, okay. And similarly here, if you see Luke, okay, Luke and Matthew also 41%, okay. Before I explain to you, you don't get confused with that, that violet color, purple color box that is there in the middle, okay, that I have not elaborated. If you look in that box, the word given over there is triple tradition. You know what is the meaning of triple tradition? By triple, there are two words, double tradition and triple tradition. But triple tradition is more common, okay. Triple tradition is material in the three gospels which is common to all three, okay. So you see that purple color in the circle. Mark is 76%, Luke is 41%, Matthew is 46%. So when we talk about the triple tradition, is common material in all the three gospels reduced to percentages. So Mark has the most material which is common in Luke and Matthew, and Matthew and Luke more or less, Matthew more 46% and Luke 41%. Unique to Mark is just small 3% of it, okay. Similarly, you have the triple tradition. You go down to the blue color coded boxes that are put out over there. That is the double tradition. Now, what is double tradition? Material that is only common between Luke and Matthew, okay. That is called the double tradition. How much of that do they share? Luke's gospel total 23% is common with Matthew 24%. Okay. Similarly, you have the other codes over here. Unique to Mark, like unique to Mark, and unique to Matthew and unique to Luke. Unique to Luke means it is material that you will find only in Luke and you will not find in Mark and Matthew. For example, the parable of the prodigal son, the woman who searches for the lost coin, okay, the lost sheep, all these parables, okay, the story of the Good Samaritan is very unique to Luke. You will not find these parables in any of these gospels. So, Lucan material that is specific to Luke only is called unique to Luke, okay. Later on in the other slide, I've marked it over there. It is referred to as L, okay. So, L means material unique to Luke. M means material that is unique only to Matthew, okay. Like here you've given in the green coded box over there, unique to Matthew 20%. Like for example, that I think it is chapter 23 or 24, the last judgment is very specific to Matthew. It is there in Mark also, but in a different way. But in Matthew, the parable of the tenants, like, we normally have that reading just before, during the Lent, I think Sunday before, I think Palm Sunday, or is it on Palm Sunday? I've forgotten that. But I think somewhere there, that especially that parable of the tenants, you remember Jesus telling them that parable, saying that he sent his servants many times, and finally the owner, he sent the son, and what do the tenants do? They say, come, we will kill him, so that all his inheritance will become ours. It is a parable which you will find only in Matthew. So that is unique Matthean material. Unique to Matthew, that is a green color coded material. Now you look here in Mark. In Mark, there is no such that. Unique to Mark is very, very small, just 3%. But majority, as I have told you, in fact, the entire Gospel of Mark is emptied into Luke and emptied into Matthew. Okay, so this is the relationship between the synoptic Gospels. We will have a look at the text at the side. Almost all of Mark's content is found in Matthew, and much of Mark is similarly found in Luke. That's what I told you. Additionally, Matthew and Luke have a large amount of common material which is not found in Mark. This common material is attributed to the hypothetical Q source. Okay, so besides this, whatever in purple color that we find, okay, that is coming from Luke. But what about this common material in the double tradition, which you find only in Luke and Matthew? 23% that blue color coded boxes, 23% of Luke and 24% of Matthew, which makes up the double tradition. From where did they get this? Okay, so that is attributed to another source which is called the Q source. Now what is this Q source? Till today, no one has ever discovered any manuscript or any extant document that tells us this. But this is a guess of all the biblical scholars, given the huge amount of 23% and 24% of Luke and Matthew having common source. What is that source? From where did they get? We do not know. We know that what has been shaded in purple color, they have probably derived from Mark. So from this you can make out that both of them had access to Mark. So from this we can also conclude that probably Mark's gospel was the first gospel. Okay, and from there Luke and Matthew have taken a major portion of their material. But from where did they derive the double tradition? From which was the source that brings common matter to both of them? That is the Q source. Why it is called Q? Q means, it is a German word called Quelle. Some biblical scholars say that it also refers, its meaning also means silent, okay, and it is also source. So a silent source, so a hidden source, a lost source which is not available to us. You remember some 2 sessions ago when I was explaining to you the Gospel of Thomas, okay, the Gnostic Gospels when we were doing, we had touched upon Thomas's Gospel was one of the Gospels which was found in the Nag Hammadi text. And in fact, when that discovery was made in 1945, and Gospel of Thomas was one of the Gospels that were found earlier, also it was found with the connection was established. Scholars were, they were upbeat, thinking that they had, when they examined the Gospel of Thomas, as I told you, is predominantly no narratives at all. It is only the sayings of Jesus, called the Logia. 114 sayings of Jesus make up the Gospel of Thomas. So it is called a sayings gospel. So the Q source document, when it was when Thomas's Gospel was discovered, everybody jumped to the conclusion that probably they have discovered the Q source. But when they closely analyzed, okay, and saw, they tried to compare this double tradition in Luke and Matthew, the common material, they realized it was not in consonance with Thomas's Gospel. And that's how they have come with that hypothesis that there definitely must have been another gospel, a sayings gospel, that is called the Q source, from where Luke and Matthew found their common material. Is this clear? I know this is a little difficult to understand, but please take time and go back and have a look at the slides and just go through them. Then it will hammer in and you will understand things better. Now solution. Now what is the solution to the synoptic problem? How will you come to know who copied whom and what is the direction of the dependence? Okay, and let us see. There are 3 solutions that are proposed. Okay? Look at the time first. There are 3 solutions. Number 1, how do we resolve this tangle of the synoptic problem? Solution 1 is called the Grey-Schwartz hypothesis, or it is also called the 2 gospel hypothesis. Now this man, Johann Grey-Schwartz, he was a biblical scholar came out with this proposition somewhere in the 1780s, in the 18th century. It was the end of the 18th century. But when he came out, it is called a Greshbach hypothesis, but it was a hypothesis which was more or less in line with whatever the early church tradition was saying. Okay, what was his simple take on this whole matter? He said, according to Greshbach, Matthew was the first gospel. From Matthew, when Matthew, did up his text by 70s, they say Matthew's gospel text was ready. After that, Luke copied from Matthew. He gave in his own theological understanding and gave a different slant to it, reworked Matthew's gospel and came out with Luke, okay, the gospel of Luke. Mark had access to both this text of Matthew and Luke, okay, and he obviously borrowed material from both of them. But the biggest question that is posed, and it is literally like you punch a hole in the whole thing and you just deflate the balloon. The biggest question they ask is, when you have two things, when you have a document, okay, and you're giving a very orderly narration, why will you keep on chopping everything? Matthew, I told you, is quite a big gospel of almost 28 chapters, and Mark is only 16 chapters. So you mean to say Mark must have just taken, randomly and just cut off like how Marcion did when we were touching about Marcion's thing? So it doesn't really make sense, okay? Matthew's text being available to Luke and Luke giving his own theological slant to it is somewhat a little bit believable, but the biggest weakness and drawback of this Greshbach hypothesis is Mark's compilation just does not fit in over there, okay? So this man was the first one who proposed this two gospel, this is also called the two gospel hypothesis, and his line of dependence was Matthew comes first, followed by Luke, and then Mark. So this is the order, okay, according to him. This was also more or less what the early church believed, okay, but not Luke. Luke was put afterwards, first Matthew, then comes Mark, Luke, and then last John. Now, why this two gospel hypothesis? Okay, what is its justification, and on what truths is it based on? Why is this proposition, still today? In fact, when Greshbach he proposed this, it got a lot of steam, but finally it fizzled out. But of late, this is, this hypothesis seems to be gaining ground. This keeps going on in the biblical scholars world. So right now also Greshbach hypothesis is back in, sort of fashion among the literary scholars. What is the reason? Why do they propose this? Under this, what are the things? First, Matthew was written first. This is the first submission made. Luke was written second, using Matthew as a source. Mark was written third, using Matthew and Luke as sources. Thus, it is chiefly based on Matthean priority. What is the meaning of Matthean priority? We will be using these two words and hearing them, constantly. Matthean priority and later on Markan priority. Markan priority is a very oft-repeated, phrase today. So this whole two gospel hypothesis is based on Matthean priority. When Matthew is the first gospel to be written and followed by Luke and then by Mark. What are the reasons to support this two gospel hypothesis? What do they offer up? Okay, what is the basis on which they make this? How do they justify that this is the way, like, how the gospels must have been compiled in what order? Number one is early church tradition greatly supports the idea that Matthew's gospel was the earliest one. Okay, and there are many church fathers who cite this, and most of the time they cite Papias, one of the early church fathers who was born somewhere in 60 AD and went on till 110, 130 something AD. So Papias had written huge volumes which today are not at all present, they are not extant anymore. But whatever he had written in the first and second centuries, it was extensively quoted even up till the 4th century by Eusebius, okay, the church historian. So what he had said, he is the one who makes, I have put out one slide wherein I will be reading out to you what exactly he stated. So the early church tradition was very unanimous in stating that the Gospel of Matthew was the earliest of the four. Hence, this theory is based on Matthean priority, that is, Gospel of Matthew to be the first. Matthew's Gospel being the most Jewish. Now, how do they say Matthew came first, but why Luke came second? The reason is spelled out over here. Matthew's Gospel, if you have a look at Matthew's Gospel, you will see that of all the four Gospels, it is Matthew's Gospel which is very powerful on Old Testament fulfillment prophecies. Okay, all the prophecies of the OT, how they were fulfilled in Jesus, and how, finally he's projected by Matthew as the new Moses, as the new lawgiver. Like how Moses was considered to be the Torah giver, Jesus is the new Moses who gives the new Torah on the Sermon on the Mount. That is why almost 3 chapters are dedicated to the Sermon on the Mount, which is considered to be like the crux of the entire Gospel of Matthew. So when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, it looked like, it was a Gospel that took extreme care of Jewish sensibilities. Which Jewish? Those who had turned into Christian, the Jewish Christians. So he was, he was utmost sensitive to the sensibilities of the Jewish Christian. But when you read such a text, which is all the time, harping only about all Jewish traditions, all the OT fulfillment motives and all, how will a Gentile follower of Jesus view this? Obviously, it will appear to the person like it is all the time talking only about Jewish traditions and customs and fulfillment of that. That is, means what is there in that gospel that will appeal to a Gentile? So that seemed to be lacking. So maybe that, the scholars, they surmise that maybe Matthew's gospel looked to be pro-Jewish, and so the Gentile Christians who were, multiplying in numbers, because that was the time the church was a growing church, the ecclesial communities were multiplying everywhere, okay, in not only 100-fold, 1,000-folds, you had communities everywhere, and the church was becoming increasingly a Gentile church. So they needed a gospel which would have, which would appeal to the Gentile Christians, and that is the reason Luke took the gospel. That is what the hypothesis says, that he must have taken the Gospel of Matthew, reworked it, giving a unique theological, slant to it, which would be very appealing to the Gentile Christians. A gospel which would not be inward-looking and exclusive like how Matthew's gospel appeared to be, but in reality not. Okay, but rather than make that inward-looking and exclusive, make it more universal and inclusive, and that's how Luke steps in. For example, Matthew's gospel portrays, I've given you instances here, portrays Jesus as insisting that all Jewish laws should be kept by his followers, and in one instance he even instructs his disciples not to go to Gentiles. Remember this particular thing where Jesus said, even there was something that I forgot it. Okay, I'll come, when I remember I'll tell you this. Okay, so when he's instructing the disciples, in particular he tells them not to go to the Gentiles. Okay, go only to the only go to the Jewish communities, go only to the Jews. Okay, so this could be viewed by the Gentiles as something that was not very much appealing to them, that they would not find any place for themselves in the growing church. It could also be read as implying Gentiles are not currently part of the church, and that is why we have Luke with his gospel, which has a very great universal vision, wherein any Gentile reader also could understand that he could be part of God's family. Hence, a Gentile-oriented gospel was needed to correct the skewed balance that's supposed to appear in Matthew's gospel. So these are the reasons that support the two gospel hypothesis. Hence, a Gentile-oriented gospel was needed to correct the skewed balance in the context of the church spreading quickly and becoming a dominantly Gentile institution. A Gentile-oriented gospel was the need of the hour, and which Luke stepped in to fill up. Come to solution 2 for the synoptic problem. This is the two-source hypothesis, which is today the most accepted theory, that it must have been like that. Okay, And what does this hypothesis suggest? That there were two sources. It is based on the concept of Markan priority, which states that Mark was the first gospel that was written in Rome. Mark was an interpreter of St. Peter, and Peter and Paul were the founders of the church in Rome. But Peter in particular was considered to be the head of the Roman church, and Mark was, being his disciple, he was constantly present when Peter was preaching and teaching. And so there is a church tradition which says that, the congregation of the Church of Rome, which also comprised surprisingly some Roman soldiers, who were there. So it was at the request of them. This is quoted by Clement of Alexandria, another church father. He says that at the insistence of these people, Mark was asked to put down in writing whatever Peter was preaching. And that's the source of Mark, oral tradition behind the actual source of Mark's Gospel. Similarly, the Q source, which I just elaborated. So under this two source hypothesis, the Q source, the Quelle, the silent source, which till today we have not a single Gospel text or manuscript, on which we can say that is the thing. But the search continues, and we never know. Could be that there was such a source available, a sayings gospel, a saying source from which Matthew and Luke, both of them, drew their material. So I put out those two. You have Q on one side, you have Mark on the other. Both Matthew and Luke take the material from there. So they take from Q, they take from Mark, and they have their unique material. That small circle with the same color code, plus M, is that unique Matthean material, which is actually part of another theory, which is an addition to this. So that is that unique Matthew material and unique Luke material. So this is the two source hypothesis. Why it is called two sources? Because these were the two primary sources from which Luke and Matthew drew up the material for their text. Main features of the two source hypothesis based on the following observations. Matthew and Luke, both of them used Mark, both for its narrative material as well as for the basic structural outline of chronology of Jesus' life. Matthew and Luke use a second lost source, which is called the Q source, German Quelle, which means source for the sayings, logia, found in common in both of them. In short, we can call it's commonly called the Saints' Gospel. Thus, Mark and Q, the Saints' Gospel, are the main components or sources for Matthew and Luke. The third solution, the four source theory. From the two source goes to the four source theory. In fact, it is not a separate theory. It is only an addition to the two source theory. This was this famous biblical scholar from England, B.H. Streeter, who came out in 1925 with this supposition, adding on to the two source theory. That is what I've already explained to you about unique material, depending on that unique material that is there in Luke and unique material in Matthew. And so he adds those also two sources, and that's how they become four source theory. This theory was first elaborated in 1925 by B. Streeter. He was an English biblical scholar, and this theory that he proposes is an addition or an improvement to the earlier two source or two document theory, where we have the Q source and Mark as the main sources for the Gospel of Luke and Matthew. It bases itself on the foundations of the two source theory, but makes the following additions to it. In both Matthew and Luke, there is material that is unique to each of their Gospels. This material is probably drawn from some other sources, which is designated M, material unique to Matthew, and L, material that is unique to Luke. This is known as a four-document hypothesis, as it proposes the synoptics to be drawn from four different documentary sources. So, the two-source theory and its addition, the four-source theory, are the most accepted versions of solutions to the synoptic problem. This is just I put out a diagram for you. Four source hypothesis. Q you have here, Mark you have here, here you have L, that is unique Lucan material. This is unique Matthew material. So all these three, okay, they flow into Luke. Q plus Mark plus unique Luke makes Luke. Mark plus Matthew, okay, unique Matthew, okay, goes into Matthew, and Mark, full Mark here. So this is the four source this hypothesis, which in addition to the two source hypothesis. So this is still better. The same idea it is, okay, four document of four source hypothesis, and just added over here. Okay, other sources also might be there. Antiochian document for Matthew, since he was based in the church in Antioch. Similarly, document of infancy, Luke must have had access to it, maybe with his proximity to the Jerusalem community, probably. So this is a more elaborate one. Okay, both of them basically give you the same idea. They'll give you Papias' testimony. The two-source theory is advocated by all prominent scholars. Markan priority on which this theory is based began to be seriously proposed in the 18th century, was fleshed out in the 19th, and now has become the dominant idea in the 20th and the 21st century. By 1960s, this had completely caught on, and today it is the most accepted version of this solution to the synoptic problem. Along, of course, with the additional to this with the four source theory. This is that early church tradition testimony of Papias. Papias was a bishop in Hierapolis. Okay, he was born, they say, more or less somewhere around 60 AD. So around 30 years after the death of Jesus, and he was a disciple of the disciple of Apostle John. So Papias, he had access to Irenaeus, he had access to many of the testimonies of the eyewitnesses. So he used to like to listen to all these things and put together. Papias is supposed to have written many books, okay, huge volumes which are all lost because probably he was not much copied because of the ideas that he had. Okay, this is the quote that I would like you to pay attention to. Papias, speaking of books about Christ written by Matthew and Mark, says these are actually his words which have been quoted by Eusebius. Eusebius has been a church historian, I told you. He was also the historian at the time of Emperor Constantine, very close to Constantine. Okay, and he was the one who was compiling the church history, and there he quotes here. Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, wrote carefully, though not in order, as he remembered them, the things spoken and done by Christ. About Matthew, he says this. Matthew wrote the Logia. Logia means what? The saints. In Hebrew language. And everyone translated them as he was able. So this is the biggest conundrum, this is the big puzzle that all the biblical scholars keep on, debating, say, or drawing out different interpretation, different meanings about it. And remember, Papias gives us a testimony only regarding Mark and Matthew. He is silent about Luke completely. Could be that, Luke was more associated with the Pauline churches, and Paul obviously had lots of dissensions with some of the early church members. We will see that later on. These statements point to two books as the fountains of evangelical written tradition. One can be distinctly named, that is Mark's Gospel. Okay, the other is a record of Logia. Okay, sayings chiefly embodied in our first Gospel, Proto-Matthew, and also utilized by Saint Luke. Okay, so this is the testimony of the Church Father. The same thing that I put out here. Yes, in 163, I think he died. Was bishop of the church in Hierapolis, in Phrygia, in Asia Minor, today's Turkey. Most of his writings, dated around 110 to 130, have been lost, except for some brief excerpts that we find in the works of who are the people? Eusebius' writings. He quotes him. What are the two claims Eusebius tells us were made by Papias that we sometimes find cited in the introduction to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark in our study Bibles? the same thing what I put out in the previous slide, but this is just summarized that Matthew's gospel was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, and that Peter was a source for Mark's gospel. Okay. So this is the big testimony on which the early church tradition always held and gave prominence to Matthew's gospel being the most. After this slide, I've just put out 2 maps. Those of you who would like to, just refer to, because you would like to see. Ellie, can you just bring it on, the next 2 slides? The session has ended, but I just put over here 2 slides for you to know that this is the place, okay? This is the place that we are all the time referring to. It's always like an L shape. That is why it's called a Levant. This is the entire region. This is all Egypt, okay? This is all Egypt, and this is the place. This whole coastal area. Somewhere down here, you find Jerusalem. I cannot see it. You will have to make it a little big. Zoom in. Okay. So I put this and the next one. Show the next one also. I just tried to get this. Okay. This gives you a brief idea of the geography of the Holy Land, so that in your minds you can just locate like what is the topography of this place that we are talking about. So this is the end of our session for today, and next time we will start with why Matthew's gospel. So with this we are almost coming to the end of the introduction to the gospels.